Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. So, in today's episode, I am joined with Counterpoints, another streamer. He streams on politics, 40k law, and pretty much everything. And I'll let you introduce yourself, Counterpoints.
Yeah, my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints. You can call me either one, Counterpoints or Connor. I'll go by either. I identify as centrist or center right, but people have also called me like a progressive Republican. I'm not religious, so I tend to be pretty lax when it comes to social issues. But I do think that there's some really important things about like ethics and economics that the right wing has correct. So I try to defend those ideas while not defending the super nefarious ones. And then I'm also a Marine Corps veteran and a law enforcement veteran. So politics and violence kind of goes hand in hand. So I like breaking down popular media about violence. And then Warhammer 40,000 is a science fiction universe that's like hyper dark and hyper violent. And it's one of my passions. I do the hobby. I do the lore. I explore the universe. I love it. So yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think, funnily enough, I was just talking to you about 40k, and I've never really gotten into it, not because I'm not interested, but just because I've not really been exposed to it, right? But I'm a huge fucking nerd. So when we talk about anything sci-fi, I'm pretty much sold almost, just based off the fact that it's science fiction. But the thing is that I wanted to discuss, and I think would be a good opening to this conversation, is during your last video on 40k, you were describing the difference between 40k, Star Trek, Star Wars, those kind of envisions of the future. And what I thought was really interesting about your description about 40k is you seem to like the fact that 40k is pretty dark. It seems to engage in a way that the future isn't necessarily all too different to the present, and that a lot of bad things can happen in the future, and are happening in the future, and will happen in the future. And the Warhammer universe itself, I don't know if it's continuous, but it seems to have just Warhammer being the continuous descriptor that kind of runs through that. War is kind of like a permanent force in this in the envisionment of any given time, whether it's past, present, or future, right? And I think that what I thought was interesting when you're saying, like, Star Trek nerds are envisioning this communist utopia, and I was like, yeah, that's me. And you kind of put that against the Warhammer universe. I mean, Star Wars is a bit different because it's almost supposed to be in the past, but it's in the future, and kind of fantasy as well as sci-fi. So I don't know how to even put that in, but I think the difference between 40k, and Star Trek is probably the difference between, in many ways, maybe how we are even approaching the topic of veganism, right? And at least I think it might be, but we'll see. So
Yeah. Just to kind of for the uninitiated, it is a combination of like fantasy and science fiction. There's orcs in the Warhammer universe. There's Eldar, which are just elves, dark and light elves, all that kind of stuff. But it's set 38,000 years in the future, and the only thing that is constant is conflict. So there's a whole bunch of like xenocidal races. Basically, every race is trying to exterminate every other race, and humanity is constantly on the brink of collapse. It's held up by billions of human beings who dedicate themselves wholly to war on a daily basis, and it also the characters that I'm following in the series that I'm breaking down, Hell's Reach, they're Space Marines. So they were supposed to be actually in the series. It's incredibly interesting because they start out as these warriors for like purity and light and rationality. As a matter of fact, the Great Crusade that they were originally launched on was actually an atheistic crusade to unite all of humanity that had been like spread through the galaxy by colonization, but they had lost contact with each other. So these Space Marines were like genetically engineered super warriors who were responsible for bringing to heel all of humanity and making them atheists. But what ends up happening is they start encountering other races that are xenocidal. They start encountering literal like demons, like demons exist in this universe. So they're explained as like extra dimensional entities, like they're living creatures that live in a different dimension called the warp. But then we would religiously understand them as demons because they're capable of possessing human bodies and manipulating material events and breaking through their reality into ours. And then this kind of throws the entire universe for a lapse where these atheistic, super secular, hyper rational warriors are confronted with like the mystery and magic of devils and demons and space magic and all this kind of crap. And eventually it corrupts some of them. And they turn in on their own imperium. They start attacking everybody, killing everybody. They seek conquest for themselves. So what was originally supposed to be like the conquest phase leading up to a Star Trek era universe breaks during its moment of birth and actually launches like, 30,000 years, or excuse me, 10,000 years at this point of unending calamitous war. And then part of the reason why it's so morally interesting is because war, like in our world, war kind of brings out the best and worst in humanity. And so in this setting, you constantly see the best and worst of humanity reflected in the most extreme ways.
Yeah.
And that's part of my attraction to the universe is seeing how good people can be, but also seeing how evil people can be, and kind of tracking that back down onto our own history.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think like to kind of counter that with like Star Trek, the in Star Trek it seems that we've overcame almost not every moral dilemma because they're faced with moral calamity in each episode, but how they approach moral calamity and moral catastrophe is in a very enlightened way, where, everyone sort of approaches with the consideration of everyone else. Or if they're not, then they're the bad guy. And it's kind of like almost that kind of like we've reached a point where there are still like issues like in terms of sentience. For example, there's a really great Star Trek episode that everyone should watch, which is called The Measure of a Man, about one of the androids in Star Trek. About the android in Star Trek Data and whether he has his own rights as an individual because he's an artificial organism and stuff like that. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I love Star Trek, because like it is enlightened space communism. But I don't mean communism. I wouldn't call it communism in the sense of perhaps the way in which, like, say, like Lenin or Marx or any particular individual has imagined communism, but really as like what Marx said is the ruling principle of communism, which is the freedom of every individual. I think that's what really has like kind of moves through Star Trek. Also, the fact that it's post scarcity. Like you can just magic things out of like computers. Like, oh, thanks, I can just like just and then you got a meal. And I love that. Earl Grey tea. Was it Earl Grey hot?
Yeah, and that's actually, so I think it's interesting to conceptualize how human beings might morally evolve post-scarcity, because I could understand, especially post-scarcity, if we took like a more enlightened approach to everything. But what I would caution, because I think this is the job of all conservatives, is to caution that the natural world trumps all. Like human beings can master it in some ways. We can use logistics and, the power of technology in order to master as much as we can. But I don't think we should doubt for a second that nature has, her own influence on us and the world. So, you could have a post-scarcity society, but then if the logistics that make that post-scarcity society kind of break down, then you're no longer living in a post-scarcity society, and you fall back into all the traps that you previously thought you had escaped. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I think conservatives, especially like there's a prepper community in America. We're always waiting for something catastrophic to go wrong.
Yeah,
and so we always prepare for the catastrophic. And when we look at people who kind of have their head in the clouds about what's possible for humanity, we're always like the pessimistic or cautioning voice saying like, hey, it's cool to strive for these things, but you always need to have a backup plan.
But yeah, I mean, I think that the I love the preppers. I'm not gonna lie. I like doomsday preppers, doomsday bunkers, all of that. Anything zombie apocalypse esque. I love that shit. But I think that the problem is like how much resources and time you actually donate into the worst possible scenario economically is seems to be like a terrible idea. Like this is why like I think ethics and economics can never be tied away from each other for that reason. Like the idea of a post scarcity society only exists if we're willing to go, yeah, so long as no one takes the piss. You know, and
Right. And yeah, and I always assume somebody's going to take the piss.
no,
Always.
that's the
Like
thing.
it's almost a presumption.
I think that's exactly like you've got to kind of calculate. You've got to factor that in, like how much piss taking can we actually take, and you know if we all, engage in this rule, like what are we all capable of, achieving together here? And I think that's kind of like with the Star Trek. You kind of get this idea, like, look, energy is abundant but not unlimited. They're still having to mine resources and stuff. Like it's not totally gone, and then but everyone seems to be given their fair lot in life, and I think that this is the problem, like that with our society especially. I think that doesn't exist. Like I think everyone isn't given their fair economic entitlement, and that's why I'm a socialist. But moreover, I think that it's also how we consider ourselves and our relationship with others. I think my issue with conservatives is the overly antagonistic relationship with nature and other individuals, atypically. And it's not to say that I don't like conservatives, because I actually do like conservatives. Like, for example, I talk from a Hegelian perspective. Hegel's pretty much a conservative. He's like a progressive conservative. He doesn't see like the traditions as a bad thing. He sees them as a good thing for the most part, and sees us moving through history in a way which we are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, pretty much, to move to something greater. And I think that's where I would stand. I think that in terms of like our relationship with nature, though, I think that our Anglo-American sort of Protestant ethic, especially, has led us to this whole dominion over nature mentality, in which we can, it's man versus the world, when in reality it's man in the world. And I think that usually leads us to places in which we accidentally, because we don't consider the consequences of our actions, are now destroying our own habitat. We are, we are causing a mass extinction event. We're causing diseases which might destroy us. I think that you're right in saying that we need to have kind of a respect for, like, almost like a respect for nature. But I think it's not a respect for nature, it's a fear of nature. And I think a respect for nature, sees ourselves as trying to be ecologists and engage with nature in a way which is beneficial to nature as well as ourselves, and not try to exploit it for any resource that we can get from it. And I think that we need to kind of transition to that phase before we'll even hit any sort of, otherwise I think we're probably heading towards self-annihilation in many ways.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because I become a lot more sympathetic to either socialism or communism after fusion power or unlimited cheap power, like whether it's like renewables or battery technology or whatever. And once automation kind of takes over and makes human effort either redundant or no longer needed in certain factors, that's where I think like, oh, half of humanity can be dedicated to, I don't know, space exploration or whatever, and half of humanity can literally just sit in their apartments in Coombe and make YouTube videos and shit. But until we get to that, like I just don't think the material conditions are correct for that, and I don't think they're going to be correct for that for another 500,000 years.
500,000. Whoa.
Yeah,
Fusion.
no, not
Fusion is
500,000.
always 30 years away.
500, yeah, 500 or 1,000.
All right, okay.
So yeah, not 500,000. So I don't. So that might be right around the bend in a historical sense, but for me, I just don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime. When it comes to your points, though, about how the Protestant work ethic or the capitalistic framework through which resources are only something to be, extracted, modified, consumed, and discarded. And the more we do that, the better. And we're not looking at any externalities. I think you're 100% correct that this is like an imbalance with nature. And we see this in the effects, whether that's like, pollution, global warming, whatever. So the conservative mindset would hypothetically say, that this is an imbalance in nature. Nature is going to get her due. So we have to rebalance the relationship. Of course, that's not what political conservatives do. Political conservatives say, no, we can do it indefinitely. Doesn't matter. Doesn't, we're put in charge.
Yeah,
We
kind of.
can ride diesel trucks that
The
get
divine
3 miles
mandate.
to the gallon, and machine gun bald eagles to death with like miniguns and like all that kind of shit. It doesn't matter because it's just it's ours to do. But even if you look at Christianity, Christianity doesn't say that. Christianity says that we are stewards.
Yeah,
A steward is somebody who takes care of the kingdom while the king is gone.
100%.
And if the king was gone and he basically, like, I don't know, did methamphetamine, rode motorcycles, machine gunned the bald eagles, cut down all the trees, and let all the sludge get into the water supply, then that king would have your fucking head when he came back. And that's kind of where I think that there's plenty of ecological and environmental arguments that can be made to Christians and conservatives. They're just
100%.
not, because they're unpopular economically.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. To be entirely honest with you, I mean, this is the kind of like the bastardization of people like Francis Bacon, because he was the one that like said knowledge is power, and then he said like and it's usually he's usually quoted and used to justify this exploitation over nature. But he was all about, like, he believed that, like, yeah, we should seek dominion over the earth. But what he took that as is as stewardship as well, through an ethic. Like, we're not supposed to just do what we want. We're supposed to do what God tells us to do, And that's kind of like, I think that is absolutely... I think it's clear in Christianity that I don't think God wants you to go and destroy the earth. If anything, the idea is to move closer and back towards, the garden. That's the idea. The idealistic earth is pictured as this picturesque garden in which we're at one with nature, and there isn't any sort of worry. And it is weird that conservatives in general, not just conservatives, but a lot of people in general do try to argue for a antagonistic relationship with nature, and I don't think one's supposed to exist in that same framework. Yeah.
Actually, I do have a segue, or not a segue here. I do have something to add.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think that this is part of what we're doing, especially with like the democratization of media in the modern age, where I'm in Central Florida. I'm on a cell phone. And I'm talking to you. I don't even know what continent you're specifically on. We're separated by thousands of miles, but we're able to do this conversation in a public space, which is awesome. And previously, even 50 years ago, media and opinion was controlled in the United States by maybe few dozen newspapers and 3 major broadcasting companies that all shared approximately the same agenda.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is the democratization of media is an incredibly powerful tool that, thank God it's here. I love taking advantage of this time and space in technology.
Yeah.
But it's also opening us up to, one, it's opening us up to nefarious propaganda. But then 2, it's also an opportunity, because I think part of the reason why conservatives think that, you can drive diesel trucks and machine gun bald eagles and it's all fucking just shit posts and memes is because they were told by an upper class of, capitalist oligarchs who basically said, like, oh, yeah, like, consumption is good almost no matter what. So we just need to propagandize the masses in order to consume without thought. And so we're still in those after effects of mindless consumption that I think that now that media has been democratized, we can kind of push for a more wholesome and holistic message. And it can be powerful because we have less gatekeepers towards like information philosophy and all that kind of stuff.
I completely
the question
agree.
is whether or not the populace is going to listen. That's another question.
Yeah, I completely agree. Actually, that's basically where I was about to go with it. I think that there is another big thing to be considered here. I think that you're completely right in saying that there was this kind of, the Americans, and not just the Americans, but essentially the world has been told from the dawn of industrialization to consume, to produce more and then consume more. And it's always been about, I think the board puts it as, we went from a state of being, from being to having to appearing. And I think that's essentially the stages in which humanity has went through in terms of industrialization.
Oof.
We started with, being human. Now then we went towards with the accumulation of wealth. And now it's about appearances and our engagement within a spectacle. And I think that's...
Which Which, like, good on us, right? Because that's kind of showing the power that you have as a species. Like, so for instance, like a lot of people talk about, modern obesity. I think it's like, 5 out of 7 people on the planet have more than enough food, and like 3 out of 7 or 4 out of 7 people on the planet are actually like overweight. Like that, that is a problem. Obviously, there's like disastrous health effects. But can we just appreciate that for a second? That we're like we
I would
conquered the
appreciate.
logistics of food for the species as a whole.
But
Now,
we
of course, we
haven't
need to
though.
we need
That's
to
the
dial that
problem.
back in.
That's the problem. We
Yeah.
haven't conquered the logistics. Like the logistics don't exist without an incentive to overconsume and fulfill like the mandate of a certain class of individuals. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think like I'm
But we're
probably.
dialing it in, all right? We're dialing it
No, we're
in.
not.
Okay.
Not
We
even.
we, we, we went from not having enough to having too much, and now we need to get back to just right. It's
Well,
Goldilocks. That's what it is.
the thing is, I like your optimism. I am far more pessimistic in that respect. Because one, I think that the
Why?
problem that existed isn't necessarily being perpetuated by a class of individuals. I think that, like, so if we look at the philosophy of people like Andy Bernays, who was, I think it's Andy, is it Eddie? Is it Edward or Andrew? I don't know. Ed Bernays, right? He was like Freud's cousin, or nephew, rather. And he wrote the book on propaganda. He actually designed the Coke bottle, I'm pretty sure. Um, the thing is that when he wrote the book, he believed that individuals were incapable of ruling themselves and required, and he points out that no matter how educated or sophisticated a population may become, they will always be controllable because they will respond to the most basic drives. They will always respond to leadership, food, water, shelter, all that kind of horrible stuff that you can manipulate
Oh,
and kind of take control
yeah.
of.
Can I rip open this can of worms? Because I've really been, oh man, I've been thinking about this a lot in the political space.
Yeah, go for it.
So have you seen the Vaush is objectively evil video yet?
Oh man, yeah. I was one of the first people who shared. I think I was talking to my politics. I was the first person who shared it. I am like
Yeah.
part and
So
parcel responsible for this like calamity because I was like I went on Destiny's server. I was sharing it. I was giving it to
yeah.
everyone because I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm just gonna posit this. I genuinely think Vaush is a dangerous guy. Like outside of the video like itself, I think it's not something unique to him. It's actually been going on for about 2,000 years. I think that he's a politician for hire. I think that he engages in bad faith, and I think that he overall wants to perpetuate a moral that always exists outside of the discourse that he's actually engaged in. It's either for his personal gain or his political gain or some form of ideological gain that exists outside of the rhetoric that he's engaged in. And I think that's just dangerous in and of itself. But anyway, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of for those of you who are unfamiliar, like I think what we can say that's positive about Vaush is he's insanely rhetorically gifted,
Oh, 100%.
has a good amount of charisma, and is able to and is able to maintain a pretty large following despite like blistering critiques, like including this video.
Yeah.
And
I,
so
I think it's actually
so
amazing that he's still around in some respects with some of the stuff that he's actually dealt with. I think that if anything, he's an incredible politician. Like I would never
yeah.
like regardless of what you say about him, like I said, like how could anyone even sustain like after
Do
all
you know
of that?
why?
Like,
So what's interesting about that is so him coming out and saying this is the game I'm playing, I think has helped. Because basically, if you're using that video or other videos or whatever, where he's like, listen, I have a preset political agenda. I think that my politics are good. I think that ultimately arguments are subjective and we're just dealing with like cults of personality and power plays. And I am going to use, like, I'm going to try to root my arguments in the real world because I think that, appeals to more people and can give you an air of authority and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, I'm gonna pick the battles and use the rhetoric that I think forwards my agenda, and I'm not gonna pick the battles or use the rhetoric that I think damages my agenda. And I think that's that's like real politics. That's like real Machiavellian shit.
yeah, it's Machiavellian,
And
but that's narcissistic. Like, sorry, continue. Sorry. Anyway, like,
oh well, yeah. But what I was gonna say is, I think that a lot of people in this space have asked me because I deal with like ideological and philosophical purists, and they're like, "Hey,
me.
we have the better ideas. Why aren't we making as much headway?" And I'm like, because you don't like snub you snub the cult of personality. You snub the power plays. And if the game of politics is ultimately attracting wealth and power to be able to impose your agenda on the world, then these people might be philosophically pure, but if they can't play the game of power, then they're not going to get very far, right? And so that doesn't mean you have to become a dishonest player, but it does mean that you have to understand charisma and rhetoric and relationships and
I
all that kind
agree.
of
I
stuff.
agree. But like, if I'm
Yeah.
placed in a political kind of, I've got to politically compromise where I've got to think, okay, like there is the rhetoric, and I think we've been doing this from ancient Greece as well, where like philosophers were taught rhetoric, not because of like precisely to debate rhetoricians and stuff, right? Like because of the kind of bad faith actors that do exist that would be doing the wrong thing. You've kind of got to like it's kind of like, put the guns in the hands of the right people, right? Like, if you're going to be able to,
Yes.
and this is the thing. I kind of get that, right? But at the same time, it's like with Vaush, and this might be a bit harsh. If I would compare Vaush politically to someone like Tony Blair, who I mean, like, okay, actually, like that's kind of harsh because Tony Blair is so much worse than Vaush, like demonstrably in every single way. Like, I wouldn't compare like actively Tony Blair to Vaush in the sense that I don't think Vaush started a war. and,
We'll see. We'll see. He's got a lot of political life left.
well, that's the thing. He's young, but the thing is that like Tony Blair compared to someone, let's say like Jeremy Corbyn, right? Jeremy Corbyn's principles, he was uncompromising, but he still managed to gain considerable popularity, the largest percentage of the Labour votes ever seen, even if he never managed to achieve government. So he was a successful politician, I think, in many ways. The difference is that he also was going against a political climate which was unfavourable, like UKIP and stuff like that, and Brexit and stuff. Like that's just a massive like political wrench, right? But the thing is that Vaush, if with the Tony Blair like figures or any political figure that engages in this kind of rhetoric, this kind of compromise with every single kind of group, pander to every single kind of group, use it as a means to achieve your own kind of facilitated ends, that's hegemonic. And that's sort of that's my problem, and I think that's exactly why we would never reach socialism, right? I think socialism in and of itself isn't just like, and I think that like people like there's a lot of the communists and stuff are going to hate us for this. It's not about material. Socialism isn't like how much wealth have we actually got. And this is why I would kind of push back and you're saying like, oh, well, I'm favorable to socialism at the point of fusion. No, it's like the difference between like fusion won't make a difference if people can't access the market. The way that the markets are functioned in the first place and the way that we engage in the market is an ideological formulation in which we wish to consume a certain amount, or we expect more from others than we should, than we are willing to give ourselves, or we aren't willing to give the entitlement to others and respect their rights. And I think this is exactly where Vaush's rhetoric kind of fails, right? Like, so for example, with the Hassan house thing, right? Like, I couldn't give, like, to be entirely honest with you, I couldn't give a shit about Hassan's fancy house, right? In many ways, right? 2.7 million, like, right, whatever. But at the same time, I do see Hassan's hypocrisy being a negative, right? Like, you look, if he's saying like, eat the rich, you shouldn't be rich, like all these, this unjustified consumption is bad. Well, wait a minute, like, you're doing it, like, and live to your principles. But Vaush seems to say, like, on time and time again, well, actually, Vaush used to say that he's being consistent and that all he cares about is consistency. But now he says, he doesn't give a fuck about hypocrisy and all he cares is about material gain, right? But the reality of the situation is that the hypocrisy leads to a material degradation. Oh, we have a bunch of people who profess, like, you see it on, like, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, people in their bios telling you that they're such good people, but then doing the same horrible, horrible shit time and time again. Like, it doesn't matter what people say.
Can I interject here, because this is actually where conservatives and like Christian ethics like really do for me it's like an absolute fucking W for all of the toxic parts of the right and all of the toxic parts of Christianity and all the toxic parts of the conservative mindset. It's an absolute fucking like nail in the head fucking W, because basically what Christian.
Oh, hello? You cut out there, man. Are you still here?
you have to be careful
Hey man,
of
you
leaders.
you're totally disconnected there for a solid like couple like
All right,
20
sorry.
seconds, I think.
What about now?
I can hear you, no problem now.
Okay, so I was going to say, hold on, let me disconnect and reconnect, and then let's see if it
Yeah,
about that. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep.
Okay. So what I was saying is it's an absolute W for like conservatives and Christians, despite the toxic aspects of their rhetoric or whatever, is because like Christian ethics basically say like, hey, here's all these ideals that you're supposed to live up to, but we basically know that you were born a shitbag and that you're not going to be able to fulfill these ideals. The point is that you try. That's pretty much like, you know, Christian idealism kind of boiled down.
Yeah, yeah.
Then
The movement
when it
towards Christ, yeah. Like
yeah, then the other thing about that is they also say always be wary of leaders who claim to be like morally upright and all that kind of stuff, like
the false
wolves in
prophet.
sheep's clothing. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yeah, yeah. I was just saying the false prophet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the false prophets, and so basically, this is kind of like my thing, where like if somebody has literally achieved like everything under capitalism, they're wealthy, they're doing well, you know, they get to basically do whatever they want sexually, they get to do whatever they want materially, and all that kind of stuff. But they constantly talk about how everybody else is evil because they don't implement some kind of like material justice, and then they have the opportunity to have a small but real impact in the material well-being of other people's lives, and they're like, oh well, I don't want to do it because that's more of a you kind of thing, that's more of a government kind of thing.
Yeah,
But it's
exactly.
like, all right, motherfucker, like how are we supposed to create this like hyper socially conscious communitarian fucking collectivist idealist world in which we're like sharing all of the resources and accounting for each other's material well-being when you're the prophet of this movement and you yourself cannot bring yourself to bring even a fraction of your wealth or influence to bear in order to implement the
100%.
material well-being that you
100%.
advocate for day in and day out.
This is a problem with BreadTube as a whole, man. Like, the thing is like, funnily enough, like, BreadTube, like, named after the conquest of bread, right? You know, and, like, one of the main arguments in that book is just the improper use of wealth that the bourgeois class are engaged in. It's just like they are squandering the wealth that we've created. Specifically, I mean, it does point out that we created it, and it points towards our entitlement as individuals, you know, within society, which is what I think everyone acknowledges. Like, look, the exploitation of labor, blah blah blah. Yeah, we agree, but one of the big problem for socialists is not just the exploitation of labor, which is indeed the alienation of labor, which is wrong, but also the fact that materially, this is turning into a system which is depriving people of their most basic needs, right? And if you've got the means to help people in like dire poverty, you know, you should. Like, and I think that this is why they look towards, you know, making the socialist state, because look, this is creating some ethically like tragic scenarios which could be solved if we distributed wealth. But if you're not willing to, like, and the real problem that, you know, supposed to be presented in the conquest of bread is how do we now redistribute wealth now that it's owned by 2/3 of the wealth are owned by the minority of the people. And I don't agree with the conquest of bread on like more, like, I don't know, loads of it, right? There's actually loads of the book I don't agree with, but I think that it's kind of pointing out the real issue here. It's like, right, there is a distributionary problem and then there is a redistributionary problem. Like, okay, we need to change the system, and how are we going to feed the hungry? And I think that is, you know, exactly where we exist right now. Like, yeah, that's exactly where we exist right now. We need to think about the pragmatics and the reality of the situation. And it's funny because Vaush always seems to do that. He's always pointing out, like, look, I only care about material, tangible benefits, and Hassan being a hypocrite has no impact on that, but it really does, because if Hassan was donating to charity, he would be having a material, utilitarian, you know, consequential difference in the world. Someone actually eats a meal where they wouldn't, you know.
Well, and we're talking about, so within like the Christian ethic, there's tithing, which is 10% of your wealth, and then within Islam, there's the zakat, which is 2.5%. And this is basically like a communitarian effort on behalf of the religious community in order to redistribute wealth within the community in order to benefit, widows, the starving, the poor, all that kind of stuff. And so, so there already exists this concept. And for me, it's like we hear endlessly, like the false prophets or prophets of socialism, talking about how cooperatives are good, or mutual aid is good, or this is good, or that is good, and this is praxis, and that's not praxis, and here's how this person isn't implementing praxis properly, and this is all that kind of shit. And especially within the strains of anarcho-communism or libertarian socialism, which a lot of these people profess to be.
That's me.
One of the philosophical goals is to create. Because the state is ultimately deemed as like a nefarious force, especially within its current manifestation, especially as like a capitalist protector of the bourgeois class, right?
Yep. Which I would say is true.
So a lot of anarcho-communists advocate for, creating parallel structures to the government. That way, the government is ultimately not needed in these endeavors. And so that's where, if you're claiming the label libertarian socialist or anarcho-communist, and you have the opportunity to take 2.5% to 10% of your wealth, that way people don't criticize you, and put it into parallel structures that eliminate the need for the government,
100%.
while advancing ideologically socialism. Why are you not doing that?
I know, it just exactly. That's exactly
you're
right.
Still rich.
That's the thing. You're still rich. You're still rich.
You can still do whatever the fuck you want almost any of the time.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I completely agree. I completely agree. I don't know.
It's exhausting.
It is really exhausting. I agree, and I think that this is why I think I'm so like I was actually like before this Vaush thing came out, and I'm making a video like in regards to Vaush at the minute, which is probably why I'm so mad. But I've had to watch. I think I'm mad because I've had to watch so much Vaush, and I really hate having to watch like Vaush in general, but like so much. Like I've had to watch like hours of it. I'm like, oh my God. But before I was doing this, I was writing. I'm still doing it. A video on BreadTube as a whole, right? I think that BreadTube has a problem with how we're approaching it. It seems like we're willing to compromise the ethics beneath what we are really trying to strive for. And, this isn't something that I think is, limited to Vaush at all. I think this is, to be honest, a lot of BreadTube. There's a great deal of care about identity, which is funny because identity in material terms, what are you talking about? Like, that's kind of the question. That's kind of like what Marx is really getting at, is the elimination of the ideological kind of consideration. So, like, it's very liberal anyway. That's what I'm kind of pointing out. It's a very liberal consideration of identity, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think ideology is important. I think identity is important, but I certainly don't think that that it's necessarily Marxist anyway, how much they consider an identity. And then there seems to be this removal of, personal responsibility. I will always wait for the corporations. Like, why aren't the corporations doing it? And then if I'm a vegan, right? So this is probably how we should probably segue into veganism in this. I'm a vegan, so I think that individuals are responsible for their consumptive habits. I think that an individual engaged in a form of consumption, if they have the opportunity to act otherwise, if it won't create an unreasonable or, whether it's possible or practicable for them, so long as they can do that, then they should act otherwise if it's going to cause a tangible amount of suffering in the world. So, for example, engaging in animal agriculture, we are creating, an industry which is perpetuating the deaths and suffering of over 70 billion land animals every year, a trillion fish every year, and causing a mass extinction event. 28% of global greenhouse gases, ocean dead zones, everything. It's terrible. It is fundamentally the worst industry that exists in the world, and it can be avoided purely by switching our diets, right? Like, pretty much. I mean, there was a few other things, like, clothing, but that's pretty much easy. Most people use like fake leather these days anyway. It's not that big. So it's not really an issue, right? All you got to do is change your breakfast, your lunch, and your dinner, and I don't see why that's an issue. Now, I was just going to say, I spoke to a few socialists, and the two socialists that I've tried to speak to in the past about this, that have used the same argument, are Xander Hall and Vaush, right? So Xander Hall said the exact same thing as Vaush, which was there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. Right, well, that's a load of shit. Like to be entirely honest with you, like that is an absolute joke.
It's a catchphrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fucking it's absolutely a fucking catchphrase. So all right. So this is where I was saying like we can move into I wouldn't mind keeping it as like the meta ethic of like personal responsibility and personal action. And I don't care if we use veganism as an example. But I do want to keep the political in mind while we're talking about this.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that we are. I think there's something to be said for it's like, we're a planet of like 7 billion people. What do our actions really amount to? And the reason why that's absolute fucking bullshit is because like every avalanche is made up of snow. Every
Yeah.
fucking beach is made up of sand. You fucking if you care about something, you start it because other people will be inspired by your example and your influence will carry out.
But
And so is it a small movement in the right direction? Sure, but it's still a movement in the right
but can
direction.
we just
And
appreciate? Sorry.
just sorry, go ahead.
I
Go
was
ahead.
just, I was just going to say, can we just appreciate the hypocrisy though? Like these are the same people
Mm-hmm.
calling for revolution, right? They're saying like a small group of individuals can act as a vanguard and inspire billions of individuals to rise up, destroy the institutions of the state, risk their own lives doing it, and establish an entirely different social and economic system. So they could do.
But doesn't that show you that these would be like the fucking in the Soviet Union? These would be the fucking commissars who kind of like hide behind the waves of infantry, where they're like, "You must be brave. You must do this. You must do that." And then they'll just send
100%.
you
I'd be
into
a
the fucking-
kulak.
They'll send you into the machine gun fodder, and they're like, "Hey, we've noticed that you participated in like 10 battles, and you yourself have never fired a shot in anger. Maybe you should contribute." And they're like, "Yeah, but I'm the commissar, so I inspire people." Like,
Yeah, exactly. I'm not gonna lie. I'm almost positive that half of Bread Troop would throw me in a gulag. Like almost definitely. I think this is the thing. It seems like as you say, like look at the communist, like the way that the communist revolutions have turned out. Like all of the revolutions have turned out the way they have. Let's be entirely honest with you, because the ideology that's been perpetuated in the revolutions has been absolutely terrible. Like it's been really bad. It's led to states that have, sometimes very good qualities. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. Some things about Cuba and about the USSR were positive, right? The role of women in the USSR, the healthcare availability in, Cuba compared to other Latin American countries to this day. Or, if we look at, like there's lots of metrics like joblessness, unemployment. They were doing way better on those things. But that doesn't mean like there were so many other problems in terms of the crushing of the subjectivity of individuals, the political persecutions, and like what is like the horrors that existed there that sort of just get like kind of eased over by and it's
just ignore that part.
Exactly.
Where, they treated women well, and they got into space first. So just
exactly
about the political assassinations, and executions, and thought crimes, and secret police, and all that kind of stuff. Just shh.
exactly. But this is the thing,
Dude,
right? I was just going to say, like,
Sorry,
the ideology that needs to change is one of personal responsibility, which is why I think that,
can I bring up how fucking rich it is that, like, communism is supposed to be a fucking society of workers, and it seems like so many of them are allergic to work.
I think that the weird thing is that I think that communism, in its, like, if you look at Marx, I think Marx had a decent understanding of what a good state would look like in terms of the free association of every individual. This is why I would still consider myself a market socialist, right? I think that there is an ideology there which is workable and makes sense. I think that the way it's been approached in terms of Marxist-Leninists has not been very good. I'm not a fan of some of the anarchists calling for blood, but I think that there's a lot of things in their thought that make sense as well. And so, like you try and build off the ideology, don't you? And I think that, sorry, I'll just quickly say, I think that what the big thing that I think that we need to move towards is the notion of personal responsibility within the collective endeavor, and I think that's found in points in like Hegel and so on. And I think this is why I would engage with veganism particularly on this point, because or with Vaush or Zanderhall on this point as well, because as soon as I point out an act of personal responsibility that could lead to political benefit, that could change the lives of billions of animals and also prevent harm to billions of humans in terms of climate change, they negate their personal responsibility. They say that there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. And I mean, hell, Vaush even tried to justify buying child pornography as being the same as buying a computer. And I think all of this, like the ends of this ideology is so perverse and so unbelievably detached from the world that we live in. That's why I do get scared of like some of BreadTube and stuff, because I think that they're not really, they don't actually care about the ethics underlying it. They care about political gain.
Well, I think they care about the ethics as long as it's not inconvenient. I think they'll espouse these moral philosophies, and maybe they'll even live portions of it, as long as it's already in line with their habits, and that's kind of where the abdication of responsibility when it comes to there's no ethical consumption. Yeah, okay, so the no ethical consumption under capitalism is supposed to be, I'm assuming, is supposed to build consciousness of where we source our stuff from so we can start being more responsible in the ways in which we source things. And it's supposed to be a critique of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
Where the dollar amount, the money saved is not supposed to trump all externalities and all moral obligations. That's what it's supposed to be used
I think
for.
so. I think that it's
not supposed to be used as a fucking excuse to say I can do whatever I want because ultimately it doesn't matter
100%.
Because I live in a nefarious system.
I think that's like, so weird.
Oh man, the misuse of that fucking quote is hilarious.
Yeah,
but
I completely agree.
I need to bring this up before I lose it, because it's been tangential to our conversation for a long time, but I just haven't thought to bring it up. So there's this dissident right philosopher called Mencius Medbug or whatever or some shit, and basically one of the things that he brings up as what I think is a valid concern about modernity and the cycles and the logistics change that we build for ourselves is that it's kind of like first you build the habit, and then like first you form your habits, and then your habits form you, right? Mm-hmm. And basically what he was saying is that in the post-scarcity environment that socialists and communists tend to strive for, in the the decommodification of basic human needs, what will happen is that since there isn't much motivation to get out of bed or do anything productive or advocate for personal responsibility or the Protestant work ethic or anything like that, then what's going to happen is communists and socialists philosophize about everybody becoming their own aristocrat, where they wake up every day and they learn how to paint and they learn how to garden and they do this and they do that, or they take on some kind of contributive role within the society. Mm-hmm. But his fear, which I think conservatives share, is that when you decommodify basic human need, and there's no real need to go outside because you already know that your needs are going to be guaranteed, there's not really much motivation to do anything outside of your home, except for maybe home maintenance, cooking, and taking care of your own shit.
But I think that's where we are. If I will say, I think that this the absolute opposite way around. That's where we're heading in capitalism, man. Where the only thing that we are going to care about is our consumption, to the point in which when we do hit post-scarcity, don't get me wrong, we are kind of at post-scarcity now in terms of need, especially our society. We can be maintained at a level, in which, I mean, to some degree, in which we will maintain our basic needs and then only express our more, less imminent desire, more imminent, less imminent desires, more consumptive habits and kind of ways to try and satisfy ourselves. I think is more what our society is really about. I think
this might be. Sorry. Yeah, this might be true, but there's still an expectation that you're going to put in 40 hours a week of of positive contributive work to somebody else. That's an expectation within capitalism, that if you expect to survive, that you're going to put I think there's 167 hours in a week. You're going to put 25% of your week towards positive contributions to somebody else's economic or public endeavor.
There is that in socialism and communism, which is why a job is a right. I think that the thing is that, and I think this is why I would say that this is exactly the difference. I would say that should quote, should exist between capitalism and socialism is about how we approach consumption. and production. It's not like one side of the coin, because they are really economically two sides of the same exchange. The production, if there's an exploitation in production, it's because someone's wanting to use it for their own consumptive habits. If someone is trying to, if someone's willing to consume or overconsume, they are doing it irrespectively of the productive mechanism which is going on, beneath their feet. And I think that this is what we need to consider. Like, when we are considering, what we are engaged in economically, socialists always talk about the productive enterprise, but we never, very rarely, talk about the consumptive enterprise that exists in human behavior. If we don't take responsibility for the consumption that exists in then our own consumptive habits, yet we expect people to, once they achieve some level of political opportunity, not take advantage of that for selfish gain, well then, I think it's just foolish. I think you've got to make people selfless before the... Sorry.
No. So this is really funny to me because it's like it's actually very easy for me as, like, I don't know, like moderate right wing or whatever, to come in and throw elbows. But I seriously think we have a lot of the same criticisms of the left. And coming from an exterior perspective, I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like a bunch of online false prophets selling underemployed and unemployed teenagers and 20-year-olds the concept that everything is dog shit, and it's not their fault, it's the system's fault. And not only that, they don't have to change anything about their personal behavior, but they do have to publicly advocate for an ideology that will ultimately result in them working less hours at a job that they care about more on a voluntary basis while their basic needs are being met. And there is no discussion about the logistics necessary to maintain a society. There is no discussion.
There's very limited economics,
dirty or disgusting or dangerous work that certain people are going to have to take on. There is no discussion about, like, the logistics of a state or the logistics of providing these things for human beings. And ultimately, this is kind of why I really, 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 really criticize the fuck out of, like, centrists and moderates and the right wing or whatever for not communicating any of these ideas, because I can't think of anything more dangerous than a bunch of fucking like fucking Adderall, amphetamine up fucking disaffected revolutionaries who have no idea how to run society once they conquer it. Because I look at like the vanguard states and the revolutions of, like, vanguards, right? I look at, like, Maoist China or the Soviet Union or whatever, and that's exactly what happened. They riled up the fucking masses in order to revolutionize a system that they didn't understand. Once they revolutionized it, they didn't understand how to run it. They ran it through. They realized that they needed to use central control in order to maintain their authority, and then they killed the fuck out of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So when I see the false prophets, as we would say, of, like, socialism online, basically setting up the same fucking cycle that I can see historically in the Soviet Union or Maoist China, then I'm like, fuck these people.
Well,
fuck
I can understand
them and their
that.
Stupid asses.
I think
and that's why I fight with them all the time.
If you don't learn from history, then you're doomed to repeat it. I think that's, like, and I was saying this to my girlfriend today, actually. I was like, can we please not repeat the 20th century?
But people seem determined to.
Yeah, this is the thing. Like, I think that the 20th century was a bad time, and I think that I'd rather, like, there's a lot of good things that came from it, but if we look to the amount of destruction and death, we really need to think about how to not do that again. And
our ability to inflict death and misery upon each other is tenfold, because we're on top of a house of cards that's even more precarious than existed in the 20th century, and the power of technology that we wield is 10 times more powerful.
Well, this is the thing.
We're in a tough spot.
Well, this is the thing. I think that it kind of comes down to human nature, but I don't believe in, like, an actual quote unquote human nature. I believe that in human nature is essentially possibility, right? I think Verno gets this right, where he says that human nature is not, like, actually like, oh, there's this tangible, you're good, you're bad, this, that, the other. But what we have is the possibility of infinite aggression, the possibility of infinite charity and goodness and love and compassion, but we also have hatred and malice and all of these different avenues of action which we can, perpetuate. And the animals, when they're angry, they're angry. When they're sad, they're sad. They kind of move through their moods in such a way that it's not like the kind of moved by instinct and impulse and so on. Humans are ideological and motivated, and the way in which we engage in life can be incredibly destructive or productive in a way that animals lack, which is why we can build societies and they can't, but also and also thumbs, but but also the reason why we can also destroy the planet and very well might.
Yeah, can I throw a wrench in this though, because I think this would actually be like a pretty fundamental difference philosophically between you and I.
All right, yeah.
So basically, like I said, I went into I went into the military. I went into the Marine Corps. And boot camp is an extremely authoritarian brainwashing endeavor. Your calories are controlled, your sleep is controlled, your regimen is controlled, how you pee is controlled, how you poop is controlled, how you get dressed is controlled, everything is controlled. And basically you're propagandized on a daily basis, and you're taught that there is an imminent threat outside of you that is trying to kill you. And if you don't pay attention to every single detail that you're taught on a day-to-day basis, you're ultimately going to be the weak link that is broken. Mm-hmm. And so this puts this incredible amount of stress on the conscious mind, to the point that the conscious mind almost disappears. And at some point, you just become a very well-trained animal.
Disassociate. I think that's quite the opposite. I'd say that's quite the opposite. It's not that you're like this is exactly where I would say. Where I think maybe the disagreement, you would see that as a well-trained animal. I would say that is exactly what we really can't do to animals. Like that level of psychological disassociation is like something that's like very human, which is like, I mean, like you're totally right, by the way, about PTSD rates reflect that training, the shift in training, for example, because of hypervigilance and all that. But anyway, sorry, continue.
But yeah. So I want to finish this point though. I wouldn't see this as separate from being an animal. I would see this as an activation of the more predatory instinctive brain. And basically, I think if you look at brain function, that this would actually be borne out by like research of like what parts of your brain you use when. You would probably be using more of your like I don't know if they call it like your limbic system or something like that, but whatever is like related to like fight or flight or survival, like a lot of those instincts are activated. And what I would say too is that one of the interesting things, because like I try to be like a really self-aware, conscious person who analyzes my own thoughts and kind of the way I interact with the world and document it as much as possible. What I would say is that in some respects, especially towards the end of boot camp, and I was like mastering the skills and I was doing well, and I was still being punished as much as anybody else, but I was also being rewarded because I was being told like, hey, you're becoming what we want you to become. Mm-hmm. I would say that was one of the most alive I had ever felt. And it's because of like the immediacy of threat, the mastery of skills, the praise from mentor figures, the activation of the subconscious instinctive like lizard brain that human beings have, and all that kind of stuff. And then I said all of this to arrive at a point. And that point is basically that I think that most human beings, while not having all of the survival skills or military skills or combat skills that like a veteran or a law enforcement officer has, I think they're about 3 meals away from activating that part of that brain. And what I mean by that is basically like to me, civilized society, logistics, kindness, like all that kind of stuff. It's a veneer, and it's a veneer that we're able to put on because for the most part, our needs are met. We're able to get food, we're able to get access to shelter, we're able to do this, we're able to do that. But if you look at criminality, especially when it correlates to like material deprivation, and then I map that on to the experience that I had, what that kind of tells me is that like a lot of criminality, a lot of instinctive behavior, and a lot of like war and ruthlessness and human cruelty is our readoption of the necessary survival instincts and tactics that we used to use in the past as a more, primeval creature. At least that's my perspective
See,
on
I
it.
would probably disagree with that massively. I think you're probably right that we are 3 meals away from, absolute catastrophe. But I think that the way in which people actually engage in this is unbelievably. I don't think you're necessarily wrong in saying like the way in which we engage with our drives, leads to this kind of high. Like I think that's probably true in that sense. Like if you go into boot camp, you're on this like, you're getting recognition, and at the same time you're getting punishment, and it's this kind of that is self-formation in a way that is in a way in which you'll be feeling like at one point down and one point up to the your roller coaster and yourself around, and then during this time you're also experiencing incredible physical exertion, right? And you're also feeling like you're achieving some sort of maybe end goal, and even some sort of ideological goal. You are becoming something which is more important and more meaningful than the life that you left behind. And I think you start seeing a greater cause that motivates individuals and stuff. And I think that that's 100% like in a way to kind of create a group of individuals who does a job, does it well. I mean, let's be honest, like our professional militaries are by far better than the militaries that we had in the in the past. But it also creates a bunch of individuals who become essentially psychologically capable of doing some pretty heinous stuff without necessarily feeling it immediately. Not disobeying orders under incredible stress and stuff like that, which is great, but also can be a negative. Sometimes maybe you should think about whether that order was right, and sometimes the hesitation kills you. That's the issue, right? So I get that, but at the same time, and we're also fighting enemies who have now engaged in this sort of psychological conditioning of their own soldiers. And so if we don't engage in the same tactics, then we end up becoming politically dominated, and it's all a mess. But besides the point, the military is, I would say, probably one of the most artificial, not natural organizations on the planet. And I think that it disciplines individuals to becoming a norm and a convention which alienates them from their feelings and their humanity, to the point in which you can, when you talk about like, this almost beastly kind of like, activation of like this flight or fight response, if all you're feeling is, a fight or flight response a lot of the time, that, if anything, tells me that it's, and the ability to turn this on and off is not the engaging in nature, but the abuse of nature in many ways, right?
It is, but
sorry.
Yeah, yeah. No, you can finish, but I do have a
Yeah, no, go for it.
objection or an addition.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So what I would say is, I think you're correct that it's an abuse of it, where you're basically like you're creating a synthetic situation in which you're kind of tapping into all these different parts of the human brain and kind of making them function in an extraordinary circumstance, which is war. But at the same time, what I would say is that if we, this kind of gets back to, Warhammer and Star Trek. What I would say is conflict and war and killing are as much a part of us as anything else. And especially one of the things that is not or doesn't feel synthetic, even if it is synthetic, is kind of the tribalistic setting that you get into when you're put into a platoon or a squad or a company. And what I mean by that is, so obviously, I have a highly doctrinated culture. You have universal purpose, or not universal purpose. You have unity of purpose. And you have unity of goals, you have unity of tactics, you have unity of conceptions, you have unity of this, unity of that. So you're all functioning as kind of like one organism, which feels very powerful. Like especially in the boot camp thing, when you kind of get towards the end of it, and you and your squad or your fire team or whatever are operating in a circumstance, and without talking, all of you are performing certain duties that are necessary to the survival of the group. And then also tapping into this, I mean, I was literally riding on a bus with all of my my squad mates, and I looked around, and I knew all of their flaws and all of their strengths intimately. to the point that I felt like I knew them better than my own family. I knew them better than anybody else that I've known since. And the reason why is because I got to see them during times of deprivation, times of stress, times of anxiety, times of, the synthetic hunt where we were doing, tactics and squad movements and, assaults and room clearing and all that kind of stuff. So I knew them to an intimate level that I haven't known anybody in my civilian life. And not only that, out of a half company of 40, there was maybe 2 of them that I wouldn't trust with my life. And I would still trust them to go into the conflict because I knew their weaknesses. But I just wouldn't let them take a specific duty that my life might be reliant upon.
Out of curiosity,
And
was
so,
that out of like you didn't think that they would like? Was it that they wouldn't perform well enough, or was it because you
yeah,
didn't trust them as individuals?
both. So they had character flaws that translated into the ways that they performed, and then those character flaws that translated into the ways that they performed made them liabilities. So basically, like let's say that I had to go to war with these 40 men. Those people, I like if I was in charge of the platoon or whatever, I would literally trust them with like ancillary duties that weren't critical to the success of the mission because I literally think the way that they performed were liable to get other people killed. And so so what I know I talked for a while, but basically what I would say is this intimacy, this knowledge and this exposure to like stress and deprivation and all that kind of stuff. It for me, it tapped into, again, something that's not inhuman and not synthetic, something that's incredibly real, which is basically tribalism. Tribal,
See, this is
tribal sentimentality, tribal affection, tribal this, tribal that.
But I think
And
that is
I would
exactly
see,
artificial. I would say that is. You see, that's the thing. Like, I think that like if you look at animals, like they engage in pack behaviors. The pack has no like the pack the way that it, when it does function, it's a very instinctual kind of basis. It's not sort of ideological with the focused goal and so on. I think that like the way that humans do engage. Don't get me wrong, we are natural entities in the world, and like you're talking about, the ways in which stress and so on impacts was a very real, circumstance. But reality in this way is a very, if anything, like I don't see reality as like reality is not like in terms of human experience is already conditioned. Like we never actually experience some sort of real that goes beyond our conditioning. Like even when we feel stress as someone who's been raised in a certain society. We feel stress and we've already sublimated our drives in sort of rationally appropriate measures, which is why you would say, look, there are a group of individuals who I would trust and there are 2 individuals who I will not trust, because I don't trust that something within them in this scenario has been conditioned right. They, as an individual, are not acting in a way which would be suitable for this environment, whilst these other ones have been. And I think that the very reason that you can make that distinction between them is because you can see the artificial construction of an individual in that production of the capacity to deal with stress in a way which is productive, shows the development in which they've experienced, whether it's childhood development, whether it's high school, like onwards into the military, and you can see them as a person, not because they have some sort of distinct non-historical nature, but because of who they are and where they're from and how they've lived their life and the conditioning they've already experienced. It's like
but this is okay. But this is where I get a little evolutionary and a little biological, right? So I would say that 3,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 50,000, I think modern humans have been around for, like 100,000 years or something like that.
Yeah, 200,000, I think.
Agriculture, like modern agriculture has really only developed within the past 20,000.
Yeah.
And that has allowed us to modify our environments in ways in which we previously hadn't considered. But if you think about like, I think we all come from one, great ancestor or something like that, like as living
10,000 breeding females, I think, like in the time of the Ice Age. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, traveling down all these different biological trees, modern humans might only be 100,000 years old, but we come from something else. Like human beings did not pop out of the dirt. Right. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is that we're talking about, a few 100,000, maybe a few million years, maybe a few billion years of instinct. all coming from, some great ancestor that we can't even conceptualize. And so I would not separate these things
I just
out
don't
as
see any
discrete.
evidence of instinct, if I'm honest. I see evidence
Mm,
of drive, and I think drive unites nature in general. Like, for example, like when you talk about it, you talk about, let's say neurochemical responses, and but like one, like how these responses actually manifest in the consciousness of an individual is incredibly unique. Like, one, if I'm honest, I'm not a biological
well, I want to
reductionist.
ask. I want to ask what you mean by unique, because if we're talking about like hunger, like every living being experiences hunger. If we're talking about anger or rage or wrath or
Yeah, but like even how like
loss,
so like
these are
how you
not just
experience.
human experiences. These are also a lot of animal
I
experiences.
completely agree. I mean, I'm a vegan, right? I'm going to argue that animals feel pain and pleasure, and experience all of these emotional gradients, just
Mm.
not to the same, not in the same way. I think that the way that we've conditioned ourselves, like, so for example, you can socially, you can psychologically condition yourself as like a Buddhist monk to detach yourself from pain to the point in which if you set yourself on fire, you're not flinching and screaming around. Animals can't do that. Like the thing is that like
Hmm.
even in the military scenario, it seems that like your reflexes become conditioned. You become
Mm.
you become a machine with a certain goal, precisely for the fact that you can be reprogrammed. If you didn't have that capacity to be reprogrammed, it's not to say that there isn't some sort of underlying base from which you've been built upon. The capacity for pain and pleasure.
I disagree. And if I could have an opportunity to explain
100%,
why.
100%.
So I think you can have conditioning, and you can have manipulations of the system, but I think the system is already there. I don't think it's discrete or separate from what human beings have achieved in the past. Even if you were to get outside of the military, when it comes to engineers or doctors or lawyers or something like that. These are all social functions that serve evolutionary advantage. If you're a doctor, healing the people around you makes you a valuable part of the community, and they'll reward you as such. If you're an engineer, then you're trying to create things that make human beings' lives easier. So you're basically contributing to the society in that way, and as such, you're going to be a valued and rewarded member of the community. When it comes to these hijacking of human instincts and impulses, I would see, weirdly enough, to get back to veganism as a tangential subject. I would see this as a callback to hunting, in which whether or not you ate that day was completely dependent on nonverbal communication with a dozen people who knew what they were doing in order to achieve the goal of violence against another creature. This is where I don't view
Then
war as synthetic. I don't view tribalism as synthetic. I view these things as incredibly deeply rooted in like
it
the
depends.
behaviors of human beings of the past, even 100,000 years ago. And on top of that, while they could be hijacked for a new purpose, these are modifications into a new purpose, not the reinvention or the synthesization of something new. And by the way, like I apply this conception like to everything. Like I don't think synthesis or new inventions or anything like that actually is anything new. I think it's the combining of multiple old things into something new, and that's like whether we're talking about flight or war, it's not, there's nothing new. We're just combining a bunch of old things into a function that we previously hadn't conceptualized.
I mean, of course, that's. I think that would still be able to produce something radically new. Like you can take DNA
Hmm.
from two, discrete individuals and produce a genome which is independent. That's like reproduction 101, right? Like even in nature, like the production of an imminent, a discrete organism happens radically with um, two separate with two separate sets of genetic material. Like it's not perfect reproduction. Even if we were to take the exact same genetic material, it still produces something new, if not different, but similar. But the thing is that, like, even if I don't necessarily disagree in the sense, in one respect, I think that the system of drives that like underpins all our psyche is the same. Like, for example, our biological responses to things like being burnt. Like it doesn't. You're going to get a pain response like if you set yourself on fire. How you actually cope psychologically, how you experience that response, is what I'm talking about in terms of social conditioning. And I think that in terms of, when we talk about human behavior, what we harken back to, and I think you brought up social Darwinism Darwinism and then kind of social Darwinism, is that this kind of Darwinian account of human nature is trying to express some sort of underlying evolutionary goal without recognizing that Darwin never really actually engaged with that. Darwin even kind of pointed towards this being a mindless process. The mind that exists, that is emergent from this process, is capable of engaging with itself in such a way that is, separate from this process. Now, I don't necessarily agree with, and it's not that I don't agree with evolution, because I certainly do. I don't agree with the Darwinian account of how evolution would necessarily function metaphysically, maybe, but I do agree with evolution and biology and the brain and so on. But
yeah, so there's an.
I guess
sorry,
the main point I want to kind of stress at home is that there is no such thing. This is, I would argue, there is no such thing as human nature. The only thing that exists are human. I think drives exist, and if you want to call that nature, fair enough. But how they are actually engaged within society is unbelievably varied and can vary almost infinitely in terms of expression. When we talk about what food do we eat when we're hungry, when we talk about and what food do we want to eat when we're hungry, what are we craving, our desires for sex being, to be entirely honest with you, totally detached from the act of reproduction, to the point in which, you even said yourself, people are probably going to live in that, like the idea of people living in their house and becoming kumas is a genuine, idea. Like, that's a genuine possibility. Like, why would they even go outside? Like, a third, was it like
these are... Yeah, so I'm happy we're getting here, because I think we do have like a fundamental axiomatic difference. Also there I want to mention something about Darwin as well. So for instance, like you're mentioning how we interact with our drives or our instincts is kind of like I don't want to misquote you, but basically what I would say to the example of setting yourself on fire, you're going to have a pain response, but then ultimately how we interact with that is something that we can condition. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that that conditioning in and of itself serves purpose. So for instance, like with the example of setting yourself on fire but not reacting to it.
I don't disagree. I completely agree with that.
Something, but I do want to get to like two other points. So no, it's fine. So for instance, like one of the things that we were taught during the military was what's called bearing, which is basically not having any kind of emotional or physical reactions to negative stimuli, whether that's, being struck or needing to pee or needing to shit or you're bleeding or whatever. We were basically taught, don't react, and then ask for permission in order to do whatever you need to do. And then if you get rejected, then you're just going to have to continue ignoring your physiological impulse. The reason why this is important, as outlined in some of the stories that we were told, is so for instance, like snipers or whatever, they will literally sit for days at a time in the same position, pissing and shitting themselves just to kill a single high value target. And so that they'll literally wear diapers out into the field so they can piss and shit themselves in order to kill one valuable person. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of like the power of conditioning. Is so you can achieve these like higher physiological responses that most humans don't even conceptualize as possible, but they all serve the purpose. And getting this back to hunting or whatever, being quiet when you're uncomfortable, you're hunting some kind of animal, you step on a bramble that stabs you through the foot. Well, if you scream, you lose your meal for the day. If you don't scream, then you still have a chance to capture your prey. So that's where these things are still biologically rooted. And then talking about Darwin towards like the unconsciousness of nature and how it evolves. I think there's a messiness to nature where it's chaotic. So for instance, I think it was either Darwin or it was another like South American explorer who was talking about like beautiful renascent nature, where renascent just means rebirth. And what he saw, probably in a mushroom or exhaustion-induced trip, was he climbed a tree and he was, looking at his bearings and all that kind of stuff. And he was trying to look around in order to see what he saw. And what he saw was the tiers of existence and life. There were the trees, there were the vines that climbed the trees, there was the monkeys and the birds that lived in the trees, there was the ground cover animals, the capybaras and the worms and the fungus and the whatever. And basically what he saw was an uninterrupted chain of living existence that fed into itself, that was simultaneously unconscious but also conscious in the way in which all of this material was constantly recycled into the chain of being, and that it was kind of like this beautiful thing. I say all of that, one, because it's a cool concept, and two, because basically while I would acknowledge that there's a certain level of unconsciousness. Some birds went extinct through no fault of their own, but just because they evolved in a weird way and they lost their ability for their food resources, so they died, right? Like it wasn't like a conscious thing. But what I would say is that we share these drives more than I kind of hear you conceding, where you can't evolve away from biological hunger. You can't evolve away from the need to strike other things.
I wouldn't argue with that. Like, I'm not saying that I do think, like, for example, I think that you're completely right in saying that there is purpose in nature. I would not disagree with you there. I'm a naturalist in terms of ethics. Like, absolutely. It's not to say that there isn't some sort of purpose in nature. I'm rejecting a Darwinian account of that purpose. I think that not Darwin, but like the Darwinian account of an ethical purpose within nature misses, I think, the point of what is actually going on in nature and how the motivated drives of the individual actually, pertain to how we develop. Like the point that I would.
So what is going on? What is the point?
So I would say that, for example, like when you talked about that sort of mushroom trip where the guy is looking at nature and seeing this cycle of like death and rebirth and this kind of interlocked connection that's existing in nature, I would agree with that. I would even say that nature is conscious through him. Like, what is nature is this experience of nature. Like, what we experience in terms of our pain and pleasure responses, this is what we consider real. And the real is something separate from our symbolization. It's separate from how we, try to create and understand it. But it's only manifest through our eyes, through our seeing, through our feelings, and through what I think Hegel tries to put it, like there is no a water exists in the taste of the animal, right? Like what we're talking about when we talk about water is actually the physical material sensations of what we have in terms of interactions with water. What we talk about in terms of every material object is actually the sensation of these objects, which is again back to that underlying purpose that exists in nature, is a self-directed drive to satisfy some sort of subject-object distinction, a means-ends distinction. We engage with, the most basic animals engage in a means-end distinction in the sense that, the end is the satisfaction of their experience. They eat to satiate their hunger. They drink to satiate their thirst. They have sex to satiate their sex drive. But it also induces pleasure. Now, humans have managed to, totally detach ourselves from the need aspect, but we've also we engage in those very same means-ends relationships, but we realize that, the end isn't necessarily some sort of non-self-directed notion, but quite the opposite, a way of expressing self, and this experience of nature, this experience within nature is what we are trying to maximize, our own well-being.
But this is so dangerous. I'm not kidding, and I'm happy that we were able to boil it down to axioms.
I think axioms one. I will totally push back and saying this is axiomatic because you're talking to a philosopher here. So I'm gonna when you say axiom, I think self-evident truth. So.
Well, okay, so I'm not saying self-evident truth. I'm saying a fundamental statement upon which to base your perspective. We fundamentally disagree on this statement, and the reason why, again, I'm not trying to strongman. So if I make any kind of incorrections in the assumptions in your position, feel free to correct me.
Absolutely,
but basically, what I would say Correct. Is I do believe in the Darwinian sense that, like, every species, every individual of every species, part of their drive, sex, food, reproduction, whatever, hunger, pain, all that kind of stuff. It is all oriented towards survival, and not only is it all oriented towards survival, but basically, if we fail in that endeavor, that is a failure. So what I would say, for instance, to the means ends distinction with animals, is to conceptualize ourselves somehow above that. Is kind of not my cup of tea. I'll put it that way. And then to also to disassociate the means ends distinction when it comes to like reward systems, for instance, like food or sex. I think is like it's actually like an existential. It's an existential and species level ending mistake. So,
well, I mean, like this is
pleasure.
The thing. Look, like so. For example,
hold
sorry,
on. I want to finish the thought.
Yeah, that's fine.
So pleasure. The reason why I think pleasure is attached to sex is because it's one of the most important things you do. You literally look at. I want to say it's like 60-70% of the internet. 60 to 70% of the internet is pornography. And the reason why it's pornography is because it's an important impulse in which we want to engage in the act of sex. Whether or not we're conscious of the fact that sex is related to having babies kind of doesn't matter. And if you completely disassociate having sex from having children, then I would say that you've biologically failed. And so this is kind of
this
like
this is
where...
it. Like I think that this is the kind of the question. I don't think that like the judgment that exists in nature exists only in the mind, right? Like there is no like the only like I mean there are factors of purposeful expression of subjectivity, which I think is exactly what we're engaged in. I think that like when we talk about like some sort of something that's going on outside of human thought and purpose in terms of ethics, in terms of our conceptions of the world, I don't think we realize what the world necessarily is actually a manifestation of not just human but sentient beings. Like there is no world outside of mind. Like there is no metaphysical existent that will continue in a way which is determinate and discrete if there was not an individual looking at it. It is actually the engagement with these drives that give it meaning. And I think
but this is where the subjective births another subjective, and the impulses that the subjectives pass on to each other are incredibly important. And so this is what I would say. Like I don't. What's that?
I didn't understand that. Sorry. Could you like?
Okay. So for instance, the act of having children. So I am a subject who is interpreting the world within my mind.
Yes.
And I choose to propagate because based off of like value system or instinct or whatever, who gives a shit? I choose to propagate. I have a son. And I impart onto him knowledge and instincts and references and ideas that help him survive.
Yeah.
I am no longer just the individual. Now I'll live and die as
I completely agree.
But what I say and what I do and what I perceive and what I pass on to the subject that I created completely determines whether or not that subject survives in the world. And that's where, for me, while I'm not saying that you're saying this, what the problem with like unlimited subjectivity and unlimited expression of individual value and reference, to me, kind of like it ignores what is obvious and it ignores what is instinctive. So for instance, like why do we even mourn why do animals instinctively mourn the loss of their children? Why do we mourn more for children young people who pass than old people?
Well, I think that like,
it's because sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say I think that I think we've very much underestimated the psychological complexity of animals throughout history. I think that's one thing that like, I think the conceptualization process that goes on within animals that are self-conscious is way more like, especially primates and stuff, and even cows and chickens and pigs. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Oh, and I mean dogs too.
Yeah.
So the reason why we mourn, and like I would explain this from my subjective experience, but I think it's true. The reason why we mourn the death of young animals more than we do old animals is because old animals have oftentimes served their purpose. They've lived their life, they've had kids, they've propagated, they've experienced the world as much as they can, and they die. And while dying is tragic and sucks in
It's
and of
inevitable.
itself, the ending of existence seems to be something that we're not instinctively geared for. So, that sucks and that's terrible. And we mourn it. But we do seem to develop a peace with the death of old animals that have experienced and propagated
Well,
way faster than we do young animals.
yeah.
And the reason why I would say that we have that instinct is because there is something biological and instinctive that isn't necessarily subjective that says that we value both. Like, so for instance, I think you and I are dealing with different value sets, but they kind of commingle a little bit. One, they haven't experienced the world as much as they could have, so there's a lost potential there, which sucks. And then two, they haven't had an opportunity to propagate and maybe in turn take their place in the cycle of creation and destruction.
Yeah, but I think
And
that
so,
like, we're talking about the exact
sorry, go
same
ahead.
thing. So I think that, to be entirely honest with you, I think that we're talking about the exact same thing. I think we're not coming from necessarily opposing positions, because, like, as I said, I'm a naturalist in terms of ethics. I just don't take the Darwinian biological understanding of nature and human behavior to be essentially anything other than a one-sided notion. I think that it explains everything in material terms, but it doesn't explain what material is in terms of how we experience it. Like, for example, we don't experience, when we engage in reality, and I think Aristotle pointed this out, you can have mutually coexisting truths. So, like, you can have a biological truth, you can have an ethical truth, you can have I think he said, for example, it is for the physician to know that a circular wound heals the slowest, but for a geometer to know why. The reality is that when we engage, like, certain truths don't even engage to that level of intimacy. Sometimes they're not even, like, they're part of this universal condition that we are, like, this totality that we experience. But in terms of, like, how we are, like, in terms of axioms, the self-evident truths and how we actually approach, like, even from the axioms, even if the same self-evident truth existed, the terms of how we understand that truth has a massive impact on the universal conclusions that we have reasoned out from that axiomatic truth. And I think when we look at something like the Darwinian account of nature, it tries to make subservient and subordinate all other epistemological modes of explanation. And I think that is a straight track to losing the other modes of explanation which add richness and value and explanatory power to what it means to be a human. Like, what it means to be an animal or a human in this scenario isn't explainable through like, for example, neurochemical responses, because before we can even talk about neurochemical responses, we ask, how did that feel? Like, what does dopamine feel like? Oh, this is the feeling that you get when you're on dopamine. You have to refer it back to the actual behaviors and experiences of lived individuals, and I think that's the real difference. I think that the Darwinian account sometimes loses the point in which these animals, like, engaged in these behaviors, not because of some sort of biological drive that existed external to them, but because they were feeling and experiencing life in a certain way. The same reason, like, when you talk about, when you're reproducing and so on, you're doing it to, you're gearing an individual with the tools to engage with life and society and hopefully take their place within a broader overall system. And I would call that spiritual, not necessarily in a religious sense, but spiritual in an artificial sense, in the sense that this is us moving beyond necessarily the conditions that nature, may, have outlined for us. Now, I would say that you're completely right in saying that there is some sort of, let's say, first cause that exists in nature. You've got this technological progression that's existed throughout, where we've conceptualized based off, our base drives. We engage with our drives in reality to a way that allows us to better progress and express those drives. Now, I would 100% agree with that if that's what you're arguing. Now, I would say that expression of our drives is coming from a first-person position. Now, you seem to think that I mean this expression of subjectivity throughout and everything's subjective. Now, I can understand why you think that, because I'm kind of saying that, but I'm saying that the way that I would approach subjectivity is vastly different to way a lot of other people would approach subjectivity online. Most people that you probably speak to talk about subjectivity in a way which is individualist. When I talk about the individual, I mean that the individual only makes sense in a terms of a universal collective endeavor. So our understanding of ourself is actually reasoned out in our institutions, in our society, in our culture. And so what we end up is some sort of cultural understanding of ourselves and our individual relationship with that culture. And we end up with what's called a hermeneutic circle. Anyway, but it's essentially a relationship.
This is beautifully said. And if I can bridge, because I feel like we were talking past each other for a second. So you're saying that the Darwinian perspective is a frame, but it's not the frame. Yeah. And it's not the only frame from which we should understand living beings, including other creatures besides human beings, because basically, like, we have the opportunity to express ourselves more than just through the Darwinian frame, and that point's well taken.
No, I'm glad, and I think that this is why I would say that ethics, in terms of, is kind of the total. What it ends up with is the totality of these points of, like, what is the good life, is the best lived experience of these of people. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I want to bridge us back to the earlier conversation, because we're coming up on 2 hours and it's 1:59, and at 2 p.m. I do have to jump, basically.
Yeah, that's fine.
But basically what I would say, the reason why, so we were kind of talking about, like, cults of personality and why certain characters are charismatic and popular, even if what they are offering substantively is either non-existent or nefarious. I think the reason why is because a lot of the harder truths and philosophical explorations of existence and life and all that kind of stuff, they don't leave you with firm answers. So, for instance, like, if you were a Christian, it's like, well, Jesus Christ is the Messiah and he came to save you and all that kind of stuff, and that's that. And if you believe in him, you go to heaven. And then same thing with Islam, is like, it's very firm. It's, it says, hey, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger, and basically do good works and believe in God, and you'll go to heaven. So that's very solid. And then same thing, even with, like, a materialist socialist lens, it says, hey, there probably isn't an afterlife, but we do have a social obligation to the people around us, and we do have the opportunity to make the world a better place than it is. And here's all these problems with modern society and capitalism and material redistribution and all that kind of stuff. And so you should make it your spiritual purpose to improve society, to make it better for everyone else, because that's what you do. Again, it's a very solid thing. Whereas you and I talking about subjective experience, and also kind of like the way that we balance natural impulse versus, like, the transcendental or spiritual, it kind of leaves you with more questions and answers, where you're like, oh, fuck. Well, like, how, if I don't have a single frame through which to analyze the universe, then how do I reorient myself to be a good human being? And then when you realize that you have more than just one frame to analyze, then you're like, well, fuck. Every single time I add a new frame, the world gets more complex, not less.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, but there is a unity that exists, I think, in reality. Like, that it's not that we can just, when we are analyzing, and I think you said this before, when we are analyzing from these different frames, we're doing it with a purpose. It's like when I talk about the institution, I think Aristotle put this best. He was like talking about the institution of war and medicine being explained in terms of a good life. It's like the contradictory institutions to exist in a society, but they're not contradictory institutions towards living a good life, because we need protection, but we also need healing. So, like, when we talk about how we are living our lives, even though we have mutually competing ends that exist in society, they're actually being sustained for a single overall end, which is the good life of individuals. And I think that is where I would take it in terms of ethics. Like, when we talk about let's say, like, for example, the political systems, I think that you probably hit the nail on the head when you talked about the communists talking about some sort of, all right, well, we're going to establish this positive end goal. I think that is precisely my critique of some, like, Marxist-Leninist kind of critiques. It's the fact that if you look at Hegel, it's not, and Marx, it's not actually a positive notion of history that's moving us forward. Like, we don't have, a positive notion of history. We don't have a positive notion of what is to come. We actually never see the future. It's the negation of what is that's moving us forward. And we're in this constant process of negating and negating. So we negate the negation, and that's what's moving us forward, like stepping from one epoch to the next, because we realize that, oh, well, wait a minute, there's bad things here. Let's get rid of those bad things and let's see, make this better. And then we come up with a new system and then we're like, oh shit, that's got bad things too. Let's make that better. And it's constantly this motion of this constant motion of trying to improve upon what already exists that's moving us forward, not necessarily but it's also moving forward our notions of what it means to improve and what we are trying to do. And this is kind of a notion of history that's been going on, which I think has been rejected by a lot of individuals. That's been kind of existed since even medieval Christianity. When you look at the notion of a quest, when a knight was to go on a quest, and that quest is go to this small town, and then and then they realize on their quest that they've got to fight this dragon and all of this crazy stuff, and then the idea of the quest turns out to be self-reconciliation, become at peace with the actions that you've actually done long before this quest, and that all of the actions on this quest were stepping stones to a greater overall purpose. That's how we should engage with life. When we don't necessarily know what the end of the quest is, that's what we're trying to discover. And I think that when we're when we fall into these existential crises and we're like, oh, wait a minute, no, I don't understand how I should see the future. Well, that's actually fine. Just trying to be a good person now and let the rest sort itself out. Question yourself on what it means to be a good person, no doubt, but don't lose the fact that the idea of trying to do the good thing is actually moving you forward.
Yeah, there's two things that actually get me incredibly pissed off, especially dealing with the lack of guidance that I had as a young person, but also with these false prophets, as we call them. So number one, within the concept of dialectic, as you brought up, there isn't an end point. There is always I think they talk about thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Yeah.
There's always an initial state. There's a criticism of that state. There's a new thing that comes born of the conflict, and then from that new birth, there becomes a new conflict. And I think that if you just look at nature or human history, there's a whole bunch of people who thought that they were coming to some kind of end state of what humanity was going to be, and then they were like, oh shit, turns out that we didn't solve all the problems. There's new problems to address. And this is part of the reason why I actually really value Jordan Peterson, despite a lot of people disliking him, is because one of the things that you really can't control your I don't know, your fate within the plot. But what you can do is you can have an orienting philosophy, basically saying I am a participant in history. My goal is to implement some level of order that I am to determine throughout my life. And also, the world is already naturally chaotic, so it's up to me to, basically not just understand, but understand and implement that order within the world. And this is a job that never really ends. If you're a child, then it's your job to learn. If you're an adult, it's your job to work and to provide for those around you and to basically take care of what you can take care of. Even as a grandparent, it's your job to participate, help out your children, take care of their children, and also to spread the wisdom that you've accumulated from an entire life to those who are coming after you. So you never run out of social roles to fulfill. People just choose not to fulfill them, and then they wonder why they feel purposeless.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that is even, the role of Christ in Christianity, metaphorically, right? His role is to is truth, to die and to be, reborn. And for humanity, it represents what our goal is actually a mode of death. It's actually a drive towards death, to change who we are to become something better, and so we have to leave something behind. And I think that that means this kind of the realization that this process is a continuous, it is a continuous process of life and rebirth, of life, death, and rebirth. And that's what's moving us forward throughout history, and I think it's made concrete in the individual lives of institutions that have made us go, progress through history, which has at least got us to this state in which we can say we can do better again.
And this is what pisses me off about false prophets, right? Is they say so if you look at the Christian notion of sacrifice, even Christ's sacrifice, It's the notion that you, in order to get something from the universe, you have to give up something that's important. This is actually like Cain and Abel. Literally, like the reason why Cain was punished was because he gave up stuff that he didn't really give a fuck about, so it wasn't a sacrifice. Abel, on the other hand, actually gave up shit that he gave a fuck about, so he did a good sacrifice. And then Cain killed Abel, and was jealous and damned. And
Jordan
you can
Peterson loves that
eliminate
as
the
well.
mythology. Literally treat it as mythology. I don't care if you
Yeah.
literally believe these things, but the point is that things that are good or worthwhile often come from sacrifice, which means taking something that's important to you and then putting it towards your idealized goal. And I think this is what's frustrating to me about these false prophets is they're telling a whole bunch of teenagers, "Hey, we have this promised land that we're going to get to, but when it comes to personal sacrifice, we're going to extrapolate sacrifice onto the broader society.
Yeah.
But you individually and I individually don't have to make any kind of sacrifice in order to get there."
Oh,
And
100%.
that's why there's false prophets, and that's why they should be called the fuck
Oh,
out.
100%, 100%. I think that there's also like that worry that like what the call for is a kind of like a purposeless sacrifice where it's this glorious revolution, and I think that this is the thing. Like I think Jordan Peterson's right in this. Life is sacrificial by nature, and I think he references like Jung in that, and I think that he's completely right. Like we are all moving towards death, and Heidegger really puts this really well. Like death isn't necessarily a bad thing. The realization that we are all going to die is what gives life meaning. And when we're engaged in this life, we need to think about now that we know that our actions are our own and we're given a finite amount of time to act. Well, what are you going to do with that time? And that's the birth of authenticity. Now, recognizing that you're only one player in a much larger game, I think is essential too. Like I think if you take a very individualistic sense on this, you end up losing yourself actually. Funnily enough, but I think that in this sense, we can see that there is these overall goals that we need to move towards in terms of purpose. Like, okay, I've got a finite amount of time. There are these purposes that I should engage in to make the world a better place, to have a meaningful impact upon the world, to express what I think is genuinely valuable. And people will literally die for these things, and at the same time manage that in relation to your own well-being, to try and enact and live a meaningful life that you think you're deserving of, or that everyone is deserving of. Try to engage in that notion where you treat yourself as an end in yourself, and you treat others as a means to an end, and you see this sort of kingdom at the end of it. But this is all concrete and cultural. You think about how you could make your family live a better life. You think about how you can live, make your city and state better, and the world as a whole at the end of it, maybe. But the one thing I will say to this is that I think that this is the movement past some sort of empty progressivism in which it has no kind of concrete relation to reality, and it's just proposing some sort of fairy tale, like the kind of Peter Pan mentality, but also against the kind of conservative, which maybe the Captain Hook. I think that this idea that what matters is something other than the progressive movement. Like what we are trying to conserve is like when we are trying to conserve, it's precisely that we are trying to conserve the good and remove the bad is the reason that you would enter into conservatism in the first place. But I think conservatives a lot of the time are guilty of forgetting that. They see only the conservative process and they see the antagonisms of the left, but forget their own dogmatism and their own negative traits that also prevent them from seeing imminent threats. Like, well, what's the point of conserving all of these traditions if global warming destroys our habitat, and all of this like greater overall changes that may have to be made for the underlying purpose that exists in the tradition itself.
Yeah, and this is part of the reason why I view my facilitation. So like I don't deem myself a nefarious character. Some people do. I oftentimes work with nefarious characters, whether you're, critical of Vaush or Destiny or Lauren Southern or whatever. Like I've talked to all these people and will try to continue to do so in the future. But I do view myself as like a facilitator. of conversation and perspective. I do have my own perspectives, but ultimately, I think these poles need to start communicating with each other, because the truth is that one pole is very extreme in one direction, the other poles are very extreme in their own direction, and we are facing such important crises. Whether you're talking about like global warming, or the war on terror, or terrorism in general, or the superstate, or identity, or religion, or anything like that, these conversations are so important that we kind of can't afford to fuck them up. And if you look at the conversation, if you look at the 20th century, you can see why we can't afford to fuck them up.
Yeah.
So when I see people like completely dive headlong into like binary factionalism, dehumanization, and the willingness to just completely ignore anything positive that another faction has to say, I lose my fucking mind.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And that's why I yell at people on the internet as a hobby, because I think it's necessary.
I think that's exactly what happens. I think that, and I think like it's hit a point now where it's become like arguably a political weapon. I know that there was that supposed to be that Kremlin report. I don't know if it's true or not, where it was arguing that the right and the left were being actively split, deliberately by Russian involvement as a political weapon to destabilize the United States, right? Like when you realize that this all has like some overall tangible like effect, then it's quite daunting even politically. But I think the funny thing is that I think we're fighting an even bigger threat, which is, I would say, is meaninglessness. Like, while society has, delved to the point in which it's rid itself of like ethical institutions which it sees as being perhaps unjustified or unjustifiable, right? Like, Christianity and religion and so on, and a lot of the time ethics itself gets sort of thrown away, and it's replaced with consumptive habits and identity politics and whatever else is going on in the markets that we may consume and scroll through on Facebook, Instagram, social media. And so we're presented with this sort of meaningless consumption where our only tangible impact upon the world is likes, dislikes, like just the consumption of what is entirely virtual content in order to sustain a virtual knowledge economy, which is being used to extract as much as possible and facilitate one group or organization's power over the world, in order to engage in some sort of like attack against the other factions doing the same thing. And I think that this is kind of like the terrifying reality, is that we are all living right now in probably the most artificially, well, when I say artificial, I mean virtual kind of spectacle that's ever existed, right? And every election there is this kind of hoopla, like, meaningless kind of like, who's going to win this time when nothing's going to change? But, and people get radicalized against each other and they don't talk. And I think that there's a real issue, is the fact that the conversations that we need to have just aren't being had. People are losing touch with their notions of self, to the point in which they're not even talking to their grandparents. They're not, and engaging with a notion of identity that existed, that's been, historically developing. They're losing touch with their own culture and society, and forming radical institutions which are set to destroy. And this is on both sides. Like, you've got right wing fucking terrorists and shit. Like, you got like the Proud Boys and the what is it, like Proud Boys and shit, like storming the Capitol, trying to destabilize a democratic process. You've got left wing people talking about saying that they couldn't even condemn them because they want to do the same thing. And it's like, look, I think everyone's losing their fucking minds here. Like,
yeah, and this is where so kind of we're back in Greece, right? And the reason why we're back in Greece is because there's a bunch of rhetoricians who are using rhetoric for their own power and wealth. Like that. This was one of like Socrates' main critiques of the rhetoricians, who basically promise, like, I'll give you the gift of gab, and you can do whatever you want with it. You can become wealthy. You can bang as many women as you want. You can accumulate power unlike you've ever imagined, and I'll teach you how to speak in such an effective way that you'll become a person of substance. And then alternatively, there was this guy that it was actually really interesting. I think it was like Xenophon or something like that, who was writing about this dialogue, where there was a Greek politician, wealthy and powerful man, who said that he resented democracy because it was the rule of the weak over the powerful.
Yeah.
And if you look at like cults of personality, you know, the Trump movement, the you know, all that kind of shit, then you can see this resentment in that same social lens. And then if you look at you know, basically Socrates said, well, that's democracy, is the, you know, the weak have bound together to overthrow the powerful. So is this not an exercise of just power? And you know, he kind of said that as a shit post, but it was still an interesting question, which you can see represented in the left, where they've said, hey, you know, all the rich and powerful people of our society are exercising their power nefariously. We need to take them out. So what's frustrating for me, and pretty much after this thought, I do have to shout myself out and go.
Yeah, yeah.
What's interesting to me is when people are completely ahistorical. Literally tomorrow on the hippy dippy roundtable, I'm going to be arguing how should we remember the founding fathers or whatever. The frustration with people who are like ahistorical is that they don't realize that the problems that they're fighting over are problems that we've been fighting over for 3,000 fucking years.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were really smart people back then who already saw the underlying problems and basically came up with prescriptions, and then those prescriptions have been implemented haphazardly throughout history with both positive and negative result. And we can look at these imbalances of power and these struggles between factions, and we can come to solutions that are better, or we can just listen to the assholes of today who are saying the same shit that assholes said 3,000 years ago, and then we can
100%.
totally fuck up society and kill each other.
100%,
And
especially
it's
when
really, it's really up to us on what we want to do and what we want to allow the nefarious personalities of our society get away with.
100%.
And that's what pisses me off.
100%. I mean, look at it like this: like 3,000 years ago, we already showed why they were wrong, right? Like, like a lot of the time, like it's like, all right, you're full of shit. You know, for the last 3,000 years, there's been groups of people showing other people to be talking shit, you know, and you would think we'd learn from that, and I think that for a while we were learning from that. But I think that,
and
like,
now we're back to square one.
well, I don't think we're square one. I think that this is the thing, like, and I think this is probably like even bring it back to square one, like when we're talking about 40k versus Star Trek. It's like whether you will engage with the Nietzschean or the Hegelian notion of history, or like even Marxian in that respect notion of history. Does history progress, or does it constantly reoccur in the same way? Like the constant the recurrence of the same is the Nietzschean notion, like, this is all just an expression of the same will to power that's existed between humans and will continue to exist indefinitely. Whilst the Hegelian or the Marxian notion is to say, like, no, we're actually in a progressive, you know, trajectory. We're actually moving towards something better and better. It's just taken some time. And I would endorse that we are moving towards better and better. But what we're existing in right now is pretty much the antithesis of the Enlightenment. We're seeing people rejecting rationality and rejecting institutional and tradition. The rationality that existed in those traditions has been rejected by the rationality of the traditions themselves. And this has been a intellectual revolution. And I think that what we need to kind of look back towards is the value of tradition. We need to see that the conservatives have a point. You know, there is a lot of value in these traditions and in these institutions. We don't want to destroy them, but we do recognize that they are insufficient for providing the goods that the very institutions themselves seek. You know, they're not capable of providing a good life for individuals, and that's what we kind of need to kind of get into when we approach these rhetoricians. You know, when they talk about, well, you'll live a good life, you know, you ask them what do you mean by a good life? When they tell you that they can talk about a specific topic, ask them what topic they're talking about, because that's the way that philosophers have always engaged with rhetoricians. Well, you know, good for who? Good for what? You know, what notion of, when you say you're a good speaker, what are you good at? What are you speaking about? What is it that you're good at speaking about? And I think that's how we kind of have to engage with this. It's been a really interesting conversation, as well. I'll let you go because I know that you need to go. And hopefully we can talk more about veganism the next time. Yeah,
sure. Like, if I go, obviously the goal is to do this full time. I'm still a wagey right now. But, you know, if I ever go full time, then you and I can start a stoned philosophy podcast where I'll just smoke a joint before we talk, and then we can just we can get into it, because these are the kind of conversations that I live for. I really hate the surface level bullshit where we're arguing the semantic definitions of one concept that is a part of like what should be a 3-hour conversation about descriptive and prescriptive policy. I really do like getting into the nitty gritty, so I want to thank you for that. And then just to shout myself out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm linking in the description as well. Sorry.
Cool. For the Perspective Philosophy audience, my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints. I am a science fiction, political, and philosophy nerd, a little bit of religion, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But I do panels, and I do... so if you like blood sports, I do panels and screaming matches and all that kind of stuff. I do one-on-one conversations like this, and then I break down, like... I'm a Marine veteran and a law enforcement veteran, so I break down violent movies and science fiction media. So if any of that interests you, please come check me out, because based off of the conversation we've had for the past 2 hours, you're the kind of person that I would want in my audience as well. So thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly the same way I'd approach it. Like, obviously, Connor's really good faith, and I can't appreciate that more. Especially when we're talking about rhetoricians and stuff. So definitely go check out his content, go subscribe, like and all that good stuff. And yeah, I'll put your link in the description. So yeah, it's been really good, man. And I look forward to talking again.
All right. Sounds great, buddy. Catch you soon.
Take it easy. Bye.